Welcome to our first week of Aging with Grace. What I am going to do for now is I'll mute everybody so we don't get background noises. I'm letting you unmute yourself in case you have a question as I'm going along. You're absolutely welcome to raise your hand and interrupt me, or you can type in, there's a chat function down at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in questions and I'll answer all the questions at the end. I won't try to read the questions while I'm talking, but you can type in questions and then I'll read them off, or you can raise your hand, whatever works. This is the first time I've offered this series virtually. I normally offer it every spring and fall in person, and of course with the virus that's not possible right now. We're beginning to experiment here with doing some presentations both in person and virtually. But for now, this time I'll do this series virtually and see how it goes. My name is Peggy Determeyer. Please call me Peggy. From the alphabet soup behind my name, you can tell I had trouble figuring out what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was in the business world, and then I became a hospital chaplain. And I didn't like the way doctors talk to patients and families, so I ended up taking a doctorate in the medical humanities in healthcare ethics and policy. And so my work here at the Hope and Healing Center is in the whole arena of aging. So I follow the Hope and Healing Center model of providing education and training on various topics. This Aging with Grace series is one. In collaboration with the Amazing Place, I offer Savvy Caregiver, which is a 6-week, 2-hour-a-week program for caregivers of people with dementia. I know at least one of you has been through that series, and you know what an excellent program that is. I do all kinds of other programs, some for the Hope and Healing Center, some for other organizations. I've been doing some programs for St. Luke's Methodist Church, for Cypress Methodist Church, and for some professional organizations. So I do both community member educational programs and training for professionals, doctors, nurses, that sort of thing. I also do individual coaching for folks with aging issues or caregiving issues, grief issues. I'm the facilitator for the Hope and Healing Center's Grief Support Group, which we're starting back up in a virtual platform next month on the second Tuesday of the month. And I do research, and my areas of interest include patient-physician communication, nurse empowerment, something called community dialogues. I'll give a plug at the end of the program for something we're going to be doing in October as a pilot with a professional organization. So that's a little bit about me. I am pretty passionate about the importance of empowering yourself to know as much as you can. I've been a caregiver for my dad. I helped him with his second wife. I even helped him when he was taking care of my mom, who died of cancer almost 30 years ago, and that was before I know as much as I know now. I've also, had health issues myself, so I've experienced some things that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. So today's talk is about patient rights and responsibilities. And I start with this because all of us is the most, it's probably the most direct to us as we age. All of us are or have been patients for one thing or another, whether it's something chronic or something that happened in medical speak. They use the terms acute and chronic. So acute is something that happens and they fix, like you have a bad appendix and they take it out. So then they fixed you and you're basically cured. Something chronic would be something like arthritis or even dementia or any of the things that hit us as we're aging. So when we look at medicine and we look at the whole business of how we do medicine, we can look at first at the traditional duties of medicine. You know, prevent disease. Medicine has changed a lot over the last 100 years in terms of starting with the simple act of hand washing was learned. It actually came out in the whole business of delivering babies, that they figured out that doctors who washed their hands in between delivering babies had fewer infection problems. The other element is to restore functioning. So if you have, I used the example a few minutes ago of a bad appendix. If your appendix is bothering you, it can be pretty debilitating. So the cure is they take it out. And because you don't, it's an appendix is one of those pieces of our evolution that we really can function quite well without it. So once the appendix is removed, problem goes away. To prolong life, when we look at the way that treatments have changed, think about a heart attack. You know, 50 or 60 years ago, if somebody had a heart attack, there was a pretty good chance they might die from that heart attack. Nowadays, there are all kinds of things. You know, there's unplugging your arteries, putting in a stent to open up the artery so that the blood can flow through better. They've got better knowledge about how the muscle works, and even bypass surgery is, in the history of things, a relatively new thing. And now it's common to talk to people who have had treatments that manage their heart condition. To relieve suffering, think about, and I'll use the example of cancer. We've gotten a whole lot better at managing symptoms. You know, when you look at the history of cancer treatments, and they first started doing chemotherapies, and they didn't really know how much medicine to give, but they would give a lot, and it would make people really sick. And if the chemotherapy didn't kill them and they survived, then at least the cancer might not be cured, but it might be controlled. But basically, medicine has gotten a lot better at managing symptoms, doing preventive things to keep people from having some of the symptoms to begin with, or reducing them. And finally, to attend the dying. And it's not much fun to think about dying, but the fact of the matter is all of us are going to. And certainly in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of attention given to the art of dying, and things were written about ars moriendi, the art of dying. And nowadays, with all of the other capabilities that we have in medicine, we sometimes forget that, yeah, we still are going to die. And even if we, you know, as people of faith, if we look at the Bible, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but eventually Lazarus still died. We forget that piece of the story. So, okay. So, when you go to a doctor or a hospital, they ask you to sign that you have been given a document called Patient Rights and Responsibilities. And I won't, normally when I do this in class, I ask people how many people have actually read that. And I will tell you on average, it's less than 10%. Because at the time, you know, you're busy, you're filling out paperwork, you're giving health histories, you have to give a list of the medications that you're on or have taken in the past. You have to remember when you had surgeries, and it really is least of your worries. And so the fact that most people haven't read it is not terribly surprising. But the rights and responsibilities that you have as a patient come in 5 different categories. The first one's financial, and I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. The second one is the treatment plan. The third one is just general information. The fourth one is policies and procedures that the hospitals have. And finally, there's a category called advanced directives. And like I said, I will talk about each of these in more detail so that you'll know what they are and you can keep this in mind so that the next time you sign this, you know better what you're agreeing to. So the financial right and responsibility is fairly straightforward. It is, you have a right to get an explanation of the charges, and you have a responsibility to pay the bill. And I encourage people to look at those explanations of charges because there are times when hospitals and doctors' offices make mistakes. I'm sure we've all heard the horror stories of people being charged $100 for an aspirin or something ridiculous like that. But even Medicare now encourages people to look at the explanation of the charges so that they know that they did indeed receive those services. I know my dad, in the last 6 months of his life, had a replacement of his pacemaker defibrillator, and he was shocked to find out how expensive that was and how much Medicare paid for that. And that's a whole nother story to talk about. The second right and responsibility is to follow the treatment plan or not. When a doctor recommends a treatment, you have a right to participate in that treatment, or if you're in the hospital, in the discharge plan. You have the right to receive reasonable requests for treatment, and the operative word is reasonable, so that if you have a virus and you want an antibiotic, the doctor doesn't have to give you the antibiotic. In fact, they'll probably try to talk you out of it because antibiotics don't do anything for viruses. And if you take too many antibiotics when you don't need them, your body will develop a resistance to bugs. And one of the problems in medicine today is that people get treatments or develop resistance to certain antibiotics, and then each time they have to up the strength of the antibiotic, and eventually there's a situation where it won't work. You have the right to make decisions for your care plans. You have the right to receive the care and to have equal treatment. You know, we've unfortunately learned an awful lot these days about how, particularly with the virus, with COVID, that there are groups who have not been receiving the same level of care as other groups. And you have the right to give informed consent to anything that a healthcare provider is going to do to you. In fact, they are required to obtain your informed consent and explain to you what they're doing, why they're doing it, what all the implications are, and you have the right to have your questions answered so that if the physician is recommending a treatment plan that is not in keeping with either your own choices or your own quality of life, you have the right to say, no, I don't want that. It's a challenge because doctors don't like to be challenged. I can tell you from personal experience that they'll tell you they want you to ask questions, but sometimes they don't really. In the category of information, this is general information. So you have the right to know the identity of your caregivers. If the doctor and the staff, doctor staff, or if you're in the hospital, the best providers will walk in and say, hello, my name is Georgianne, and I will be your nurse today. And sometimes they'll even say, I have been doing this for 15 years and I will take very good care of you. That is something that some of the care providers have adopted because research has shown that that is a way to begin to relate to between the caregiver and the patient. You have the right to get information about patient rights, hence the way it's done is sometimes rather haphazard, but it's important that you know that you have that right. You have the right to an interpreter so that if your primary language is not English, or if you are hearing impaired, you have the right to have help in translation. So when I was a chaplain in the hospital, there were several times I had patients in the ICU who were either Spanish speaking or had hearing impairments, and the hospital was required to provide help for those families. You have the right to receive information about treatment options. So many times there is more than one way to treat a condition. And in fact, if you've been reading up on it, they've had some articles recently about appendectomies that they have found that in some cases, they can give the patient a round of antibiotics and it will take care of the problem for the time, and they can postpone surgery. You have the right to access your medical records. And this is sort of a double-edged sword because you have the right to access your records, but the hospital or doctor has the right to charge you for that. So what I have found, what I tell people the best way to do is go to your primary care physician and ask them to request the records, because on a transfer like that, they should be done without charging you for it. And finally, you have the right to have your family member, your family physician notified. One of the things, if any of you have been in the hospital or have had a family member in the hospital, you have learned that in this day and time, unless there's a specific provider that you've been talking to, like a surgeon, the person you see in the hospital is not your general day-to-day physician. So some years ago, I had a bad appendix and I ended up in the hospital. And the person that became my attending physician in the hospital was the surgeon, not my regular doctor. So I had to make sure, I had to follow up once I got out of the hospital to make sure that she had gotten the information that she needed about that particular hospitalization. Policies and procedures. You have the obligation to follow the rules and be considerate. But in that, you have the hospital or doctor has the right to, has the obligation to tell you what those policies and procedures are. And they're obligated to observe your privacy and maintain your confidence, and to make sure that they're behaving in an ethical manner and that your self-image is preserved. This is an important one. You have the right to be free from restraints. Now, some of you may have had patients, particularly in the ICU, that developed a condition called ICU psychosis. And so the patient will sometimes, for their own safety, so they don't try to climb out of bed, be restrained. But the doctor has to review that order every single day and sign for it. And you have the right to be free from abuse, so that when things are going wrong, they're not allowed to be mean to you, to slap you or be verbally abusive or whatever. And if there ever comes a time when that is happening to you or to a family member, ask to talk to the patient liaison. All hospitals have patient advocates on the staff, particularly the larger hospitals here in Houston, have patient advocates on the staff, and they will work with you if any of these kinds of things are not being done. And then the last one, and this is the one I'm going to spend the most time on, because this is the piece where learning to advocate for yourself will be helpful to you in terms of getting the kind of treatment that you want. So you have the right to prepare advance directives, and the hospital or doctor has an obligation to tell you how to do those documents. But I'm going to tell you today what it is and how to do it, and the kinds of questions to prepare for yourself. So the first question might be, why would you want to do an advance directive? Well, all of us, if we were to stop and talk about what's important to each of us, every one of us has a personal sense of who we are, what we like to do, what control we want to have, goals we have, both for our life and for our health cares, and things that we hope for. And so the Advance Directives Act, which was promulgated back in the 1970s, empowers us to exercise these goals. And advance directives grew out of several cases that ended up being decided in the courts about what level of care is appropriate at certain times in our lives. So some of you may have heard about Karen Ann Quinlan or Terry Schiavo, or some of the other cases that have happened. Karen Ann Quinlan was the first. She was a woman who had an eating disorder, and her heart stopped and she ended up on life support. And after being on life support for several years, her parents said, she's not coming back. So why are we doing this? And they went to the hospital and said, we want you to take her off of these machines. And the hospital said, no, we won't do that. So they took them to court, and her parents convinced the court that this was not what she would have wanted, and it wasn't what they wanted for their daughter. And so the it, the interesting development was that the hospital was somewhat, I want to say, maliciously obedient. They were able to take her off the breathing machine, but in the court case, they had not talked about her artificial feeding, the feeding tube that was in her stomach. So they left that in. And so as a result, Ms. Quinlan lived for another 10 years in her unconscious state. You may remember a more recent case with Terry Schiavo in Florida, where many people got involved, where there was actually a disagreement between the husband and the parents about what they wanted to do. And so eventually the court sided with the husband that, based on the statements that Terry had said, that this was not a manner she would want to live in. So what are different goals of care we might want? Well, the first thing we want for anything we have is a cure, because, that's the best of all worlds. You have something wrong with you, they're able to cure it and fix it. So if you have a hot appendix, they take your appendix out, you're fixed, it's all good. Unfortunately, with some conditions like cancer, MD Anderson's advertising of making cancer history notwithstanding is there are many cancers for which there's no cure. They can control them, they can manage them for many years, and so the goal is to avoid a premature death. The other is to maintain or improve your function. If you look at, say, kidney disease, that used to be deadly. We now have medications and we have kidney dialysis that can improve the function that the kidneys provide to prolong life. I've already talked a little bit about relieving suffering and maintaining the quality of life. And certainly I would guess that most of us want to stay in control with whatever's going on. And these different goals often happen at the same time. And they may also be contradictory, and some may take priority over others. So depending on what's important to you, it's important to think about what are my own goals, and I'm going to give you some questions shortly to ask about that. And the reason we have to do that is because in the whole environment of care, things have changed a lot. So first of all, medicine's ability to control life or preserve life, and that's a function of medical specialization. So we laugh about having all these different doctors, but the fact that we have cardiologists and who specialize in diseases of the heart, we have thoracic physicians and surgeons, we have neurologists and neurosurgeons, all that kind of specialization has enabled people to get really smart about one part of the body. And that has really helped us to preserve and prolong life. The other one is surgery and anesthesiology. If you look in the annals of healthcare and think about what different practices were for surgery, they were pretty unpleasant. And the fact that anesthesiologists can put you to sleep and wake you back up have done a lot to improve healthcare. Intensive care units have done a lot for us. Normally, if you're on a regular floor in a hospital, every 6 or 8 patients will have a nurse. Well, and an intensive care nurse will have typically only 1 or 2 patients, sometimes 3, but that intensive ability to take care of people has done a lot to keep people alive. The other thing that has changed is that organ failure may not equal death. So when we look at heart, lung, kidneys, there are things that have happened. So for example, I already talked a little bit about dialysis. If your kidneys start to fail, you can do dialysis, and there's drive into a center and get your dialysis, or there's even a dialysis they can do at home while you sleep at night. And so that will keep the function of the kidney so that you don't die. Artificial nutrition and hydration, that has done a lot for people who have temporary issues where they can't eat. I have a friend who some years ago was being treated for esophageal cancer, and he had to have a feeding tube for 6 weeks while he healed from the surgery that had been done to control the cancer. And that 6-week term with artificial nutrition fixed it so that he got better. Different heart and lung assists. We've seen a lot in the news lately about ventilators that will essentially breathe for you and make sure that your body is oxygenated when they can't work for themselves. These are all technologies that have done a lot to help us to prolong life. But they've also created ethical quandaries. I'll give you an example. When kidney dialysis machines first came out, there weren't enough machines to go around. And that was actually the birth of the first ethics committees in hospitals, because they had to make choices on who would get the dialysis machines. You've heard some of this in the environment of the COVID crisis, where the hospitals were concerned that if the virus ran completely out of control, they wouldn't have enough breathing machines to go around. And fortunately, we skirted that, but they were able, through doing some different things and different kinds of makeshift breathing machines, they were able to fix it so they didn't have to make those choices. And then finally, there are different cultures that accept all of these different treatments. There's been a lot written about the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses don't accept blood transfusions. And those are opinions that different groups have about different treatment options. But all of this is part of our environment of care now. So when thinking about the goals and priorities, your goals should guide the care that you have and to help you figure out what the priorities are. And you would, of course, review that anytime your health status changes or you have an illness that's advancing, or even in the setting of the care and your treatment preferences. So what are the language? I want to have the best care possible until the day that I die. I heard a doctor say one time, I'm alive until I'm not. Other people have parameters. They say, I want to live meaningfully, or I want to be independent, or I want to have boundaries. And then there's the classic, I want to die with dignity. And that looks different for a lot of different people. So then the question becomes, who makes those decisions? Who gets that information? And how do we talk about that information? So the priorities have to be developed based on your own values, preferences, clinical circumstances, and it's influenced by information that you get from your doctors and other healthcare team members. So here are the two questions, and I boiled it down to this based on one of my colleagues at my PhD program, who was an attorney who took a doctorate in healthcare ethics. What are my life goals and what are my healthcare goals? Those are the two fundamental questions, and I'm going to talk a little more about those. So first, I want to make the differentiation between capacity and competency. You'll hear this language used by doctors and nurses all the time. So it has to do with the ability to make your decisions based on your understanding of what's going on with you. So that means you have to be able to understand the information. You have to be able to use it rationally and appreciate the consequences and come to a decision for yourself. It's optimal if you communicate your choices before you go in the hospital, but that may not always be the case. But there are, particularly if you're taking care of someone who has dementia that is a progressive disease and always going to get worse, it's important to begin to talk about things before you get to the point where the person's not able to make decisions for themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about the legal ramifications of competency next week when we talk about doing wills and stuff like that. But fundamentally, it says you must be able to make a decision based on your understanding of the facts. It doesn't mean, and this is important, that you can't change your mind. So if you say, I do or don't want to do something, you can change your mind later on, but you must be able to explain your understanding of what the implications of that change are. For example, if you say, yes, I would like to be put on a ventilator, and then you learn more about what that entails and you say, no, I don't really want that, then you have to be able to explain why you don't want that. I had a patient when I was a hospital chaplain who was in the ICU, and he was terminally ill, but he was not actively dying. And he was on a ventilator, and he told the doctor he wanted to get off. And the doctor said, look, you're not dying now. If you let us keep you on the ventilator for a couple more days, then we can take this off and you will be able to breathe and you'll be able to go home. If we take you off the ventilator now, you won't be able to breathe on your own and you'll die now. So he thought about that and he was of sound mind still. And he said, okay, I'll stay on the ventilator for a couple more days. And they kept him on the ventilator for a couple more days. They were able to extubate him. He was able to breathe on his own and he was able to go home. So what are the different sources of information? The best one is directives that are in writing. The other one is what the patient has said themselves and their general values and beliefs. So when we go back to Karen Ann Quinlan, she didn't have advanced directives because they had not been invented yet. But she had made statements to her parents and she had expressed values and she had lived her way. And so the next best ethical decision is the best interest determination. And so when you are asked to make a decision for someone, then you can base it on how they've lived their lives and what they've said and what's important to you. So in the state of Texas, and we had several people sign up for this class who are not in Texas, but most states Well, all 50 states have some form of advanced directives, and they may have different names, but so what I'm going to talk about right now is what they are in the state of Texas. There are 4 different directives. The medical power of attorney, the directive to physicians, which is commonly called the living will, a declaration for mental health treatment, and an out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order. So I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail. So the first one is the medical power of attorney, and that's where the person designates someone to make decisions for them if and only if they're not able to speak for themselves. So anytime you're awake and alert and you have capacity, anything you say goes for that moment, and it transcends anything you've said in your advanced directives. So speaking for yourself is always the best option. Unfortunately, there are times when you're not going to be able to. One of them is while you're under anesthesia. One of them is if something happens that, for example, people with advanced dementia are not able to speak for themselves. And in the state of Texas, all you need are 2 witnesses. The document can be notarized, but doesn't have to be, and copies are acceptable. So if you complete a medical power of attorney, the easiest thing to do is print the one, and I'll give you the website at the end of this presentation. You print it off, ask your neighbors or someone who's not a family member to witness your signature, you're done. Then don't give away your original. Hang on to your original. And if your doctor wants a copy, give them a copy. If you go to the hospital, they'll ask you to, and you have directives, they'll ask you to provide them. So give them a copy. Don't give them your original. The directive to physicians, it's got a really long name, directive to physicians and family or surrogates, also called the living will, permits you to make choices in the case of a terminal or irreversible illness. So in the state of Texas, a terminal illness is defined as one where the person has less than 6 months to live. So if and the example I use is you have terminal cancer. You know, you've had cancer, it's been treated, it may have gone away a couple of times and come back, but there comes a point where the illness is terminal. And so if you have, if you deem, if the physician deems that you have less than 6 months to live, you indicate whether you would or would not want what are called heroic measures. Now, again, the state of Texas has not done a really good job of defining what a heroic measure is, and I've even had doctors tell me that they don't know what that means. But what it's commonly presumed to mean is that you would want CPR if you stop breathing. And that takes a lot of understanding about what cardiopulmonary resuscitation is. So in CPR, what we see on television is a pretty benign pounding on the chest. In real life, it is much more aggressive than that. And in fact, many times when they are doing CPR on you in the hospital or even in the street, they'll break some of your ribs. An irreversible condition is one where you can be treated but not cured. So advanced Alzheimer's is an irreversible condition. If someone's had an advanced stroke, a very serious stroke, and is unconscious and not likely to regain consciousness, that's deemed an irreversible condition. It can be treated, but it can't be cured. Again, the document needs 2 witnesses. It could have a notary, but doesn't have to, and copies are acceptable. The Declaration for Mental Health Treatment is a more unique form in the state of Texas where folks with mental illnesses can make decisions in advance about specific treatments, such as psychoactive medication, convulsive therapy, and emergency mental health treatment. Interestingly enough, even though I work here at the Hope and Healing Center and we help a lot of people with serious mental illnesses, I've never been asked to help someone document this. The final document is really important for people who are terminally ill. It's called an out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order. So if you're in the hospital, the doctor can write an order that says, do not do cardiopulmonary resuscitation on this person if their heart stops. It's sometimes called allow natural death, or AND for short. An out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order is applicable if you don't want emergency response personnel to do CPR on somebody who's terminally ill. So by law, if your heart stops, whether you're in the field or at home or visiting your friend or sitting in a restaurant, if your heart stops, emergency response personnel are required to do CPR on you. And this is the only form that has to be countersigned by a physician. So if you have an out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order, make sure that either the attending physician where the person was most recently in the hospital or their own physician has signed it. And this has to stay with the individual. Funny story, my mother-in-law lived to 108 and she had an out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order and she kept it in a jar in the refrigerator. Don't ask me why she did that, but she did. And she had a fall one day and she was still conscious. She wasn't unconscious from the fall, but they took her to the hospital to check her out. And while they're driving to the hospital, she's telling the attendant, "Don't you dare resuscitate me if my heart stops." And so the technician called my sister-in-law, who was her medical power of attorney, to confirm that my mother-in-law knew what she was talking about, and most assuredly she did, and my sister-in-law confirmed it and said, "Please don't resuscitate her because I don't want to live with the consequences." So here's a way to approach a way to talk to your doctor if you or someone you love is diagnosed with a serious or life-limiting illness. The first question is, can you sketch the usual trajectory of my illness? How is this going to play out? Then the next question is, what do you hope this treatment will do for me? How will it make me feel? What are the side effects? What are the pros, cons, and alternatives of the proposed treatment? You'd be surprised nowadays at the different options, even for something like cancer. Not everybody who gets cancer has to do chemotherapy. Not everybody who has a heart attack needs bypass. So looking at the different pros, cons, and alternatives is a way to assess what it is that's important. Remember I said, ask yourself what's important to you. What is it like to die of my disease, and how can medicine ease my symptoms? There is something called palliative care. And unfortunately, even many doctors don't understand what palliative care is meant to do, but it's symptom management. So that it's a way, for example, if you have cancer and you're doing chemotherapy and it makes you sick, they can give you medicines to keep you from being sick. And so there are things that medications can do. And so, for example, what happens a lot now, if you are, particularly if you're in a major cancer center like MD Anderson, or even the cancer center at Methodist or at Memorial Hermann, if you have a really serious form of cancer, they'll put a palliative care doctor on the team that takes care of you, because they found that people whose symptoms are well managed do better and are less likely to die quicker. They're more likely to live longer. Another question, will you still be my doctor if I decide to opt for hospice or comfort care? So hospice is a service, not a place, but it's a service for people who have a terminal illness. So under the Medicare rules, for example, you're eligible for hospice if the doctor expects you to die within 6 months. Unfortunately, doctors are really bad at prognosticating and don't like to prognosticate. So in the United States, most people end up being on hospice for less than 2 weeks, even though they're eligible longer. And also ask, when do patients with my disease benefit most from enrolling in hospice? This is particularly important if your loved one has, it can be cancer or heart disease or dementia or kidney, or is in kidney failure. So any of these things that could be life limiting, these are good questions to keep in your back pocket and to ask. So those are the questions to ask your doctor. The questions to ask yourself are, what are the activities or capacities that make my life worth living? What are my greatest fears and regrets? Given that my time may be short, how do I want to spend it? This is really important because we all have things, as I said a little while ago, we all have things we love to do. And I've, for example, I've made it clear to my husband that if I can't do most of what I'm doing now, which is reading and teaching and helping folks, you know, if something's happening to me, then let's judge that accordingly. One of the important questions, doctors, as I've said, aren't really good at having these conversations with families. So sometimes you have to drive them, and you have to say, look, doc, these are the things that have been important to my husband. How does this all fit with what you're proposing to do? Because at the end of the day, as people of faith, we want to leave a good emotional legacy. We want to enjoy whatever time we have left. We may even want to go on an adventure. My husband and I are working on a bucket list that we established of trips we want to take. It's kind of on hold right now, but we're hoping that by the end of next year, we can start doing things again. And we want to leave our loved ones in good shape. So, in summary, know what's important to you. Think about your plans before you need them. Formalize it with directives. Put it in writing. What I didn't say with the medical power of attorney, that it's really important to pick a person who will do what you want and not what they want. So in the state of Texas, the automatic default, if you do not have a medical power of attorney, is spouse, adult children, parents, siblings, and then after that, anyone who's willing to make a decision. Your spouse may not necessarily be the best person for you. It might be one of your kids. Or if you have more than one child, it might be one of your children might be better inclined to do what you want or be more familiar with what your wishes are. So it's really important to talk to your family to help them to understand what's important to you, so that if they have to step in and speak for you, they do what you want. So here's some different resources. There are lots of books. Lately, there's been a plethora of other books, and I tried to keep up with most of them. The best one I found is Being Mortal, which was written, about 5, 6, 7 years ago by Atul Gawande. He's a physician. He's an oncological surgeon at Harvard, and he's written a lot of stuff. But Being Mortal was a bestseller and was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year. I've actually done a book study here at the Hope and Healing Center, and I'm going to be doing one with St. Luke's in October. But it's a lovely book, and I think you would find it well worth your time to read it if you haven't read it already. The Art of Dying Well by Katie Butler. Muriel Gillick is a physician who's written The Denial of Aging. Aging is important. You know, we're all aging. And there's something called a Caring Conversation Guide done by the Center for Practical Bioethics. It's a wonderful little booklet. Since they're in Kansas, their directives that are in the booklet follow the state of Kansas. But what they have in there are lots of questions and ways to think about what's important to you when it comes to healthcare. There's a website called mydirectives.com. Unfortunately, they charge a fee, but they do have a way where you can do the directives online and they're stored there for you. Respecting Choices is a national group that grew out of Gunderson Healthcare in Wisconsin. They're doing a free COVID toolkit through the end of this year, with lots of resources and ways to talk to your family. And then there's the link for the Texas Advanced Directive Forms. If you're not in Texas, then you can just follow. And I think now we can go to questions. Here's my contact information. If you ever need help with any of this stuff, I have helped hundreds of people complete directives. I can help you talk to your kids. That's one of the services we provide here at the Hope and Healing Center. So whatever way I can support you on that, just give me a call or send me an email. And all this information is also on our website.